Hello, everyone. Um, it's really great to see everyone here and online. I can see people trickling in for I wanted to say our nth annual Pip Pattison oration, but I don't know what N is because we started in 2019, but then there was like COVID and blah. So how do you count annual? And then I started getting, okay. So anyways, thank you for coming to our Pip Pattison oration. Um, I want to begin by first acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And I'd like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are here or online. Um, Also, while I'm getting started, I wanted to extend some thanks to the people who really helped set that up. Elizabeth, who you will have seen, she did much of the grunt work in making this happen. Simon Cropper has also been really pivotal. And I'd also like to thank everyone in the hub for being the kind of place that someone as eminent as Simon Kirby wanted to come down and visit from around the world. So it's really a great pleasure to have him here for the Pip Pattison oration. And just to uh, give you a little perspective on what we're trying to do with the oration. So Pip Pattison, who, sorry, Pip is right there, I was really chosen as the person that we've named this oration after because she embodies a lot of the spirit of what the Complex Human Data Hub tries to be, and also that Simon Kirby embodies. So she was and is one of the preeminent quantitative mathematical psychologists back when there were not many of them, and she did really pivotal work on social networks, combination of using precise mathematical quantitative models to understand information flow, but tying it in with what we actually understand of psychological theory in humans, um, uh, and really spanning uniquely levels of explanation from individual to collective. And Simon really embodies that spirit, both in the was ahead of his time in many ways, and does super interesting work that is both quantitative and behavioral, understanding humans from the individual to the collective group evolutionary level. So he's very strongly in that intellectual spirit. I want to motivate this a bit by, I'm going to share a personal anecdote, which unfortunately dates me a bit. Um, but back in 1999, I was super interested in language evolution. I was an undergrad, and I was like, but how do you even study that sort of in a sensible, way? Language doesn't fossilize, you can't. And I came across Simon's work, which was at that point, I want to say almost, well, at the time I thought the only, and I still think was among the only work at the time, which he showed basically how you could use computational modeling to actually solve some in principle problems in language evolution, like how compositionality evolved. But more than that, he was actually able to tie the experiment or the modeling structure to actual experiments. So you could actually validate it. And it kind of blew my mind at the time. And I was like, this is what I want to do. Um, and I actually applied to work on a PhD with Simon. And then I got cold feet because I was like, no one will give me a job doing this. um, and I'm very glad that I was proven wrong in that, the field has really caught up with Simon. And if you look around the field, there's so much work in language and cultural evolution that uses many of the principles and approaches that he pioneered. And yeah, and that's reflected in many of his honors. I won't list them all, Simon, Fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, blah, 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 lots of great things. I just don't want to bore you. You guys can look it up. And it really is very deserved. I'll also mention that he's also an accomplished artist and musician. Um, and I think that's kind of in keeping with the philosophy of the hub as well, which we very much think that art and science kind of go together with very similar sensibilities. So I don't know if you'll talk about your music at all, but I just wanted to throw that out there. Regardless, we're very privileged to have Simon here. So I hope you give him a big round of applause and welcome him.
Thanks so much, Andy, for that lovely introduction, and thanks all of you for coming here. at your like 6:30 in the evening and my 6:30 in the morning or something like that. So I'm just waking up. So that's good. Um, I'll also start with a little personal anecdote. So this is my second time in Melbourne, and the first time was nearly 25 years ago. And I came here at the invitation of Janet Wiles, who is professor of computer science. And she was running a workshop on evolutionary computation and cognitive science here in Melbourne. And I came here and met for the first time Morten Christensen, and we went hiking in the Grampian Mountains, I think that's what they're called. Um, and while we were hiking there, we hit upon the idea that, hey, maybe we should try and uh, make a book that collected different ideas about how language evolved. And the book Language Evolution came out of that. And that basically kind of kick-started my career. So it started here in Melbourne. I really hope it's not going to end here in Melbourne, but like, let's just gloss over that one. It would be a fitting end. Okay, so I study language, and why do I study language? So I'm going to give you an idea of why I think language is interesting, and then I'm going to talk through three studies that I've done trying to unpick why we have language. I'm going to do this in a completely non-technical way, as non-technical as possible. Um, and mainly because I think it's actually quite easy to do that. So what I'm going to talk about isn't actually very complicated. Linguists, I'm a linguist, tend to make things sound very, very complicated when they're actually quite simple. So I'm going to try and convince you of that. Um, so what I'm doing right now, as I'm trying to advance the slide, what I'm doing right now is I'm breathing out really slowly whilst moving various things inside my mouth and my in my voice box at incredible speed in this very intricate ballet of movement. And that modulates the breath that's coming out, and then the sounds I make are hitting your ears. And that's what language is. Um, that trick, and I'll explain why it's a special trick, is our species' greatest trick. It is that we are able to do this and somehow able to convey any thought, right? I can take a thought inside my head and make it appear in some form in your heads, just doing this like weird breathing out across my vocal articulators very slowly. Um, this trick, the trick of being able to talk about anything, is arguably has what made our species so successful. And when I say successful in kind of raw evolutionary terms, there's an awful lot of humans on the planet and very, very few chimpanzees. And it's probably because we have language, because with language we've been able to build um, um, a cumulative culture that it is able to support things like this activity we're doing now. So what is this amazing trick that we're doing? Well, it's actually really, really straightforward. Um, I'm going to ask you to imagine that I'm walking along a path last year in the evening, um, and I tell you this sequence of sounds. So this is I saw two porcupines. Okay. And you might have something like this image in your head, perhaps. So two porcupines, which I took a photo of, crossing the pavement in front of me. So what have you done there? How have you been able to take that sequence of sounds and understand that meaning? The way we're able to do that, and the way you've been able to do that, is because that sequence of sounds is not some kind of monolithic kind of alarm call. It's made up of parts. So this set of sounds, I saw two porcupines, is made up of individual parts like this. So there's an I saw two porcupines. And those parts can be reused. So I can use those sounds, those sequences of sounds in other sentences to generate other meanings. So I can, instead of saying I saw two porcupines, I could say I saw two dogs, and you would see something like this. And that's really it. Like the fact that we can do that with language, that we can take these individual subsequences and reorder them and reuse them in different combinations, is what gives language its ability to convey any thought. It's a really, really simple design trick. Make your signals out of parts and reuse those parts. What's really remarkable is that humans, with some maybe some edge cases elsewhere, are basically the only species to do this. And that's despite the fact that communication is absolutely rife in nature. Essentially, all living things communicate. But only humans do this kind of communication where we have parts that we recombine and put in different orders to make new meanings. And these parts in language exist at all sorts of different levels of description. So we talk about phonemes, the individual sounds like that I there. We talk about morphemes. So that's the z at the end of dogs, which signals that there's more than one of them. And then words, slightly bigger, they can be combinations of morphemes like dogs. And then phrases, which can be combinations of words like two dogs. So language is made up of these recombinable units at multiple levels of description. And the fact that it is made that way allows us to communicate about anything. So another way of thinking about this is to say that language has systematic structure. What do I mean by that? I mean that to understand language, you can't just look at an individual utterance and just say, okay, that utterance means this meaning, and now I'll move on to another utterance and say that utterance means this meaning. To understand language, you need to look across the whole set of possible utterances and the whole set of possible meanings and look how they're organized together as a system. It is, as I said, it's very rare to find this elsewhere in nature. So a typical example of a communication system in nature might be alarm calls of various primates. And those don't look like this, right? So an alarm calling monkey might have a particular sound for leopards and another one for snakes. And each of those can be considered individually. They don't form a system. They don't form a system of recombinable parts. Okay, so the mission for an evolutionary approach to language is to basically come up with an answer for why and how humans came to have a communication system built from these recombinable parts. So that's kind of what we set out to do in the late 90s, as Andy said, and we're still working on it. Takes time. But I wanted to start like just sort of intuitively thinking about what would be an attempting answer to this kind of problem. So I've said that this is a trait that humans have that's different from other species. It's obviously very beneficial to us. It's given us enormous ability to live across lots of different environments and so on. So what's a natural way of explaining this kind of thing? So a tempting answer to this question is to explain it just like any other trait a species has, which is to look at biological evolution. So the picture might look something like this. So we have genes, and some of those genes are involved in creating some kind of cognitive apparatus. And that cognitive apparatus allows us to produce language in this form, right? And on the assumption that having language in this form is beneficial to us, we might expect these genes to evolve to create this cognitive machinery to have these properties. So if that were true, what we'd be essentially saying is that language is like some kind of biological organ that has evolved just like any other biological organ, like the heart or lungs or so on. So this was kind of actually a fairly mainstream approach to thinking about language evolution in the 90s and before that, to treat it as a biological property of our species that evolves through genetic evolution in the normal way. But when I started working on this, really felt that there was kind of something missing here in this view. And there's something else going on that isn't going on with many other biological traits of a species. And that's on the other side of this diagram. So here I have each of these brains producing some language. But as you know, the language you speak, you're not born with the language that you speak. You learn it, right? So the language I'm speaking now, I'm speaking because I was exposed to people using English in my speech community as I was growing up. And the language my kids speak, they speak because they're exposed to me amongst other people producing utterances. So the fuller picture looks something like this, where we have each of these brains learning from the product of the previous brain in some kind of process of cultural rather than genetic evolution. So languages persist through a process of repeated learning and use over many generations. And that's running alongside and in some interesting ways independently of process of genetic transmission as our genes are passed on from one generation to the next. Now, it's not like people who espouse this kind of language organ view didn't know that that's what was going on. It's just they didn't think that there was much explanatory purchase to be got by looking at this to understand these fundamental properties of language, like the origins of these kind of recombinable parts. But what I want to one of the things I want to convince you today is that that's false. And in fact, this side of the diagram is where all the cool stuff is happening, right? So this is where the engine for the emergence of this this systematic structure of language comes from. And we want to be able to study this process because it will provide us with explanations for language structure which don't require us to say that they're built into some language organ that evolved biologically. And then in the end, I will bring back the genes and say what I think is going on there. Okay. So before we get into that, how on earth can we study this cultural process that I'm talking about? How can we study the cultural evolution of language? Well, the two ways that we came up with in Edinburgh mostly was one was to build miniature models of cultural evolution in computer simulations. And the other was to build miniature models of cultural evolution in the lab with real participants. And for this talk, I'm going to focus on the lab work, but you can ask me afterwards about computer simulations. I think that the best approaches are ones that combine both and like move those two methods in lockstep with each other because they both have strengths and weaknesses. Okay, and I'm going to go 3 examples, and they're going to get increasingly weird as we go through. Okay, so the first example you might already think is weird, but you ain't seen nothing yet. Right, so first experiment. So this is a joint work with Yasmin Motamedi, Marika Schaustra, Jenny Culbertson, and Kenny Smith. I'll put these QR codes back up at the end. So these link to open access versions of these papers. So what I'm going to walk you through with this experiment is a method that allows us to kind of strip away participants' language and look at what they do when they don't have language available to them. And the way that we do that is kind of really straightforward, actually. We just get people into the lab and say that they've got to communicate certain things, but they're not allowed to speak. Right, so people very, very naturally start using gesture to do this. This is a method pioneered by Susan Golden Meadow called silent gesture. It's a beautiful technique. People love it. It's like a rare experiment of mine where people actually enjoy taking part. And it's remarkable the strategies people come up with to communicate. Like humans are just desperate to communicate all the time. And so if you take some part of it away, they'll happily fill the gap. But what's interesting is how they do it. Okay, so I'm just going to this part of the talk is just going to be lots of videos and no graphs. Okay. The paper's got graphs, don't worry. So I'm going to show you what we got somebody into the lab, put them in the booth and asked them to communicate a particular concept and just using gestures and no speech. And this is what she did. So I'm going to get you to guess what it means. Okay. Any guesses? Arresting. Okay, this is, in fact, what we do in the experiment is we give them a table of choices. So there's two participants in most of our experiments, and we ask them to pick one of these meanings as the one they think they mean. Now, if you look at these meanings, you'll notice there's some structure to them, and that's intentional. So, for example, along this bottom row, there's police officer, prison, handcuffs, and to make an arrest. So those all have the same kind of theme. Along the columns, for example, the first column, chef, baker, photographer, singer, hairdresser, police officer, they're all kind of people. So there's kind of people, places, tools, and actions or verbs, okay, across these different categories. So which one did people think that was? Now you've got a few more choices. So good. Yes, so that was to make an arrest. Okay, so people can do this task. They're actually really good at it. Here's another one, another participant. I really love this guy. Okay, so which one was that? Church? Yeah, amazing. You're really good. Right. So this was church. So this is just like cold, right? We brought them in, said do this task, and then they would do it. We'd record them. And so people are really good at this. So you could look at that and say, well, is that a language? No, I don't think so. Because when you look at a whole set of these, they're doing it all sorts of different ways. It's much more like that alarm call idea where you've basically got a one-off solution to a communication problem. You've got a meaning you've got to convey, and here's my solution to it. It doesn't have that systematicity, those parts that are recombining that I talked about. So what we thought was, well, what if we get two people to do this task over and over and over and over and over and over again for like 2 hours? What will happen to the way in which they're using these gestures to communicate with each other? So we do this with like two cameras in two booths, and people take it in turns to communicate and then guess a meaning, and they get feedback, and they just keep playing this game over and over again. So what will happen? So what we wondered was, is there in this process of ongoing communication with each other, will they get these recombinable parts that we see in language? No. And I'll show you what happens instead, because it's one of these things that like afterwards you're like, ah, yeah, I guess that makes sense. So this, right, have a guess at what this means. Yes, yeah, it was indeed church. So again, they're not impossible to decode, but that's much faster than what we saw before. What about this one? Prison, yeah. It's really, really good. Right, so these are really effective um, systems of communication, incredibly efficient at this point. And so what's happening here, and if you've ever played Pictionary and you'll find this thing happening when you play Pictionary with someone. So this is where you play a game where you draw a concept. If you play with the same partner over and over again, you'll start getting more faster and faster and faster and faster until you're just like drawing a line and someone says what it means. So what's happening here is in this process of communication, they're getting more and more efficient strategies, but this structure, this recombinable structure isn't emerging. So simply communicating is not enough to get this language-like structure. But I've said it's cultural evolution that's important, and cultural evolution is, sure, it's about transfer of information between pairs of people, but it's more than that. It's about transmitting communication across generations. So we want to have a setup where And each artificial generation, we bring people in and we train them on the product of the previous generation's gestures. So what we do is exactly that. We get people to play the game with each other in pairs, and then we record their videos, and then we take, so there was 24 meanings in that grid, and we just randomly take 18 of those meanings, and we show the videos of those meanings to the new pair of participants who come into the lab. They watch the videos, and then they play the game for a while. We record them. We take 18 of those meanings, random, and give those videos to the next pair of people who come into the lab. Okay, so we're recreating this process of cultural evolution in miniature in the experiment lab. So let's see what happens. So this is the same concept for church that you saw. So the first guy is just someone who's coming cold off the street, just doing one meaning. So we take a subset of those meanings, give them to the next pair of people, and so on, like I just said. Don't need to repeat it. So I'm just going to show you first one meaning being transmitted down over 5 generations in this experiment. So first up, this is the one you saw. This is for church. Very nice. Quite elaborate, has many elements in it, I guess. First generation. Okay. I mean, it's similar. There's some innovations there that are a bit different, but there's a sequence of things going on. Now look at 5th generation. Right, so there's these 2 parts, right? That's the thing I want you to notice is there's 2 parts. There's a square and then there's this. And that means church. Is it even more striking if I show you, these videos are really small, but I hope you'll still be able to see what's going on. So I'm going to show you a slice out of that meaning space, okay? So this is just all of the people gestures. And on the left is going to be the 1st generation, and on the right is going to be the 5th generation, okay? So first I'll start animating the ones on the left. And just have a look at, just visually get a sort of look at what's going on here. And all sorts of different strategies to convey those meanings, okay? Quite elaborate, very pantomimic, okay? They're representing the thing being conveyed in a pantomime way. That's why they're so easy for you to understand. Okay. Right, now let's look what those same gestures turned into after being 5 generations of minds have had to go at them. That's it. So one of these is much shorter. The second thing, it's incredibly synchronized over different trials. So, but nearly all of them have, all but one of them have a point to self and then some other gesture. Okay. And so this point to self means this is the person category. And then the other gesture means is what the theme is. So there's these 2 parts. And when you look over the whole system, they're recombined in this recombinatorial way, what linguists call compositionality. And we see that emerging only when we have this transmission from generation to generation and communication between participants. So how does this work? So one way of thinking about what's going on here is that to survive over multiple generations, a language must be learnable. Now, notice the trick I've done there, right? I'm not talking about people surviving over generations. I'm talking about your language surviving. So just imagine for a moment that the language is like an organism that's living with you and being passed from generation to generation. So if the language I speak has got any chance of getting to surviving to later generations, it has to be learnable, right? Kids need to be able to learn that language. Now, what kids get is not every sentence of English, because there's an infinite number of those. So kids get a finite subset of all the possible sentences in English. And yet they regularly in their lives, probably most of the time, they're having to produce sentences that they've never heard. Like you've probably never heard someone say, I saw two porcupines. Probably not. And I only started uttering it when I was rehearsing this talk. And yet we've got no problem understanding it. So language has to be learnable, but it has to be learnable from this radically restricted subset. So you have to take this subset of meanings and reconstruct everything from it. If a language doesn't have that property, it's not going to survive from one generation to next, or at least not all of its details are going to survive from one generation to next. So learners must be able to reconstruct unseen utterances, things they've never seen before, from a finite subset of all possible utterances. And our argument is that this systematic structure that we see in language is an adaptation by language itself to this challenge of being transmitted over generations through this sort of finite subset, this kind of bottleneck on transmission from generation to generation. So in this view of language evolution, rather than thinking of the language faculty as somehow adapted to make us better at language, we can think of it in the other way around and think of language as being adapted to be better at being passed on by us. And this view cashed out with a range of computer simulations and other models, and with experiments going alongside it, turns out to be a really effective way of understanding a lot of features of language, including this property of compositionality that I talked about. But I'm going to move on to my next experiment, because in this experiment I just showed you, the crucial thing here was that these things that people were doing meant something, right? There was a relationship between the bits of the gestures that they were producing and bits of meaning that they wanted to convey. But we wondered if we could say something about where these sort of recombinable parts come from in a setup where there are no meanings. Would it make sense to say that we could get this recombinatorial structure without meanings in an experiment? So this is an experiment I actually did initially, I think it's about 15 years ago, with Hannah Cornish and Kenny Smith, and recently, in fact, just a few months ago, found the data on my hard disk and realized that I could work with Inbal Anon to have a completely new analysis of that data. So it was quite satisfying that this data just sat there unpublished for a long time, because I've been kind of waiting for the right way of looking at it, and Inbal provided that. So I'm going to start with an observation about another observation about language, which is very well known, which is that the distribution of words in a language is highly skewed. Okay, this is sometimes called a Zipfian distribution. So on this graph is a plot of the frequencies, the relative frequencies of the first 500 most frequent words in English. Okay, so the word the is there, and at position 400 is the word important. And the thing that's really striking about this graph immediately is how skewed it is. The most frequent words are way more frequent than this long tail. Interestingly and importantly, when you plot this graph on a log-log plot, you get this straight line. Okay, so and this is the Zipfian distribution. And this is true of all languages, spoken languages, written languages, sign languages. It's an absolute universal for human language. It's actually really hard to find it elsewhere. There are skewed distributions in animal communication, but they don't fit this straight line. There's they fit another distribution which isn't as constrained as this Zipfian distribution. So that's interesting. So what we wondered is whether this distribution is also a result of adaptation to learnability, like we saw in the previous experiment. So to test this, well, actually, I say to test this, but I've just told you that I did the experiment years ago. So this is like classic scientist post-hockery, but I did this non-linguistic sequence learning experiment because I just kind of wanted to see what would happen. This experiment's called the Simon game, which isn't me being incredibly big-headed. It's because when I was a kid in the 80s, 70s, um, I really wanted this game, the Simon game. And I think it's a deep injustice that my parents never got me this. Like, it's named after me. Um, and so I really wanted to do an experiment where I got the excuse to go on eBay and actually get one of these, which I did. So what the Simon game does is you see a sequence of lights lit up, and then you have to repeat the sequence back. They were simpler times. Um, so that was the game. Basically, you do that. And so what we did in this experiment was we basically created an experimental version of the Simon game. And we got people into the lab and we gave them 60 of these sequences. And they just played the Simon game over and over again. So you get a sequence of colored lights, and they were completely random. And then you would try and copy them, and then you'd get some feedback, and then you'd move on to the next of the sequences, and you'd do this 60 times, and they would all be random. Okay, so people enjoyed it to start with, and by the end, they wanted to kill us. And then subsequent participants in the experiment, and this is what makes it this cultural evolution experiment, they get the sequences that the previous participants produced, irrespective of whether they got them right or wrong, right? So the errors that people made in copying these sequences become the sequences that the next participant has to copy, and so on. Here's what the experiment looked like. Pay attention. Easy, right? It's really, really hard, right? So we ran this, I think we ran the whole experiment 10 times. Uh, I believe maybe even no one got any sequence correct completely in the whole experiment. Um, in that first generation, where they're all just doing random sequences, is incredibly difficult. But over time, as I'll show you in a second, it actually becomes really easy. So this is the sort of data we can get. So this is just taking one of those sequences and seeing what it changes to as it's passed from generation to generation. Okay. But remember, there's 60 of these. So, and we ran the whole experiment 10 times, and we do it for 10 generations. Okay. So you can see some things going on here. So initially, the sequences change quite a bit, and then sometimes they get longer, which is not what I expected. I thought they would get shorter and shorter, but sometimes they get shorter, sometimes they get longer. But there comes a point where the sequences stop changing, which means that people are able to copy these sequences very well. So by the end, this sequence at the start has turned into red, blue, green, yellow, red, blue, green, yellow, red, blue, blue, green, green, blue. Okay, that's what's happened to the evolution of this one kind of lineage. So the first thing we can measure is that these sequences do indeed. Oh, there's a graph. There are graphs in this talk. So over time, these sequences become easier to learn. Okay, so this is a graph of error on the vertical axis and generations on the horizontal axis. So the sequences are becoming easier to copy. Now, the participants aren't changing. They're different participants, but they're not selected to being good at this task or anything. The task is evolving to become easier for the participants to play. Okay, so there's something going on that's making these sequences easier to learn. And that's kind of where I'd sort of stopped at that point 15 years ago, is like, how did they become more learnable? And it's only until recently, like the last few months, that I've been able to give an answer to that in the work with Inbal and Arnon. And the answer is that what's happening is that recombinable parts, which are shared across the set of sequences in the set of 60, are emerging from these larger holes. So the participants are starting out copying these big chunks, and gradually smaller parts are emerging that are starting to be used across different games in the set of 60, just like we see in language. Now, more interestingly, or more excitingly perhaps, the distribution of these parts is becoming skewed. And it's becoming skewed exactly in the way that language's distribution is skewed. So the distribution of these parts becomes Zipfian. So how on earth do we test that? So we need a way of taking these sequences and chopping them up into parts. And this is where I was stuck for a long time. And the intuition was when I was discussing it with Inbal, who's an expert on language acquisition, is to use techniques that people use for studying infant speech segmentation. So when an infant hears, "I saw two porcupines," the infant isn't getting to hear where the spaces are between the words, because in our speech, we don't have spaces, right? So infants have to figure out how to segment speech into parts. And the infinite learning literature, particularly work by Jenny Safran, has shown how they might do this. And the way they do it is that they appear to scan through sequences, keeping track of how likely the next sound is given the previous sound. So these are called transition probabilities. And the idea is that within a word, sounds are quite predictable. About what sound's going to come next is quite predictable within a word, but it becomes very unpredictable between words. And so that drop in predictability is a cue, even if you don't know what anything means, for segmentation. So we just ran that same pipeline on the Simon game data. So specifically what we do is we look at a pair of colors in the sequence and compute the probability of the next color given the set of 60 sequences we have. And then we move along and we do the same thing at each step. So here we're saying, what's the probability of yellow given the previous two colors were yellow, red? What's the probability of red given the previous two colors were red, yellow, and so on? So we can just scan across the sequences and we get like probabilities. Here I'm just mocking them up with like thickness of arrow. So a thick arrow would be a high probability thing and a thin arrow would be a low probability thing. And what we did was we looked for wherever there was a big drop in these probabilities and said that's a cue for us to say cut this sequence here. Okay, so there's a few steps there, but it's basically just looking at this data as if it was data being directed at a child and say, how would the child choose to chop these up based on this sort of drops in statistical likelihood of the next color. And by doing that, we can chop all of these sequences up into parts and build a little lexicon of subsequences. And what we found is that over generations, these sequences are cut up into smaller and smaller parts. So small parts are emerging out of this set of holes. Furthermore, that these cues for segmentation become clearer and clearer. And the way it does that in our data is that the probabilities within words within the units become higher. So these subunits that we're discovering over generations are becoming more self-coherent. So there are more and more strong cues for segmentation emerging over generations in this data set. So over time, just by this process of kind of copying that the participants are doing, we're getting this bigger structure that emerges over the whole set of 60 games that the participants are playing, that is something like a lexicon here. And that lexicon becomes clearer and clearer and clearer over generations. Now, the nice thing about having a lexicon from this data set is that then we can look at the frequency distribution. So this is what it looks like at the last generation. And we can see very clear Zipf-ian distribution has emerged in this data. So by the end, the statistical structure of these sequences of these games is such that there are units, they're self-coherent, and those units are distributed according to Zipf's law that we see in language. And we can even see, one way of like assessing how good distribution fits to Zipf-ian distribution is to basically look at the correlation between the log count, the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis. And that gives us a view of how that changes over generations in the experiment. And we see that over generations, these distributions become more and more and more Zipf-ian. And the final like cherry on the cake is because we're arguing that it's learning that's driving this process. What we'd really like to see is whether this skewed distribution over these parts that we're extracting from the data can predict how good people are at playing the game, right? And this is one way of showing that. So on this axis we have entropy, which is a measure of how non-skewed the data is, and the vertical axis is how poorly people do on the task, what their error is. So we see that there's a clear relationship between how skewed this distribution of parts is and how easy participants find the Simon game. So this structure is emerging and it's improving the learnability of the experiment. And this is true even if we factor in generation. So it's not generation alone isn't enough to predict the change over time. Okay, so just to summarize how this works. So learners start by learning these whole sequences and break them down into parts by using these statistical cues. And a skewed distribution over those parts aids learning. So this process of cultural evolution that we've created in the lab builds these parts and builds this skewed distribution as well. And again, we can think about these in it's a sort of apparently circular argument, which is quite common in evolutionary thinking. We can say, well, a skewed distribution and having these recombinable parts aids learning. But it's because it aids learning that they appear in the first place. So the statistical structure of language that's very sort of diagnostic of something being a language is both cause and effect of greater learnability. So language structure emerges because it makes language more learnable. All right, so that's two examples. One maybe somewhat like language, the other one very much less like language. As we were doing these experiments, we started thinking, well, this general design of getting a participant to do something and then taking their output and giving it to another participant to do is actually quite, you can do this with lots and lots of things. And we started thinking, could we actually try an experiment like this, but not on humans, but in a non-human primate? And so that's work that I've done with Nico Cladier, Joël Fagot, and Kenny Smith to see whether this process of this kind of emergent systematicity is uniquely human or whether we can create it in another species. Now, Joël and Nico have this amazing facility in Marseille, where it's a facility with captive baboons. It's quite an interesting setup. So these baboons wander around this enclosure, and in the enclosure are these kind of porta cabins. And whenever they like, they can come into one of these porta cabins and they enter this device. Now, these devices have a touch screen that they can access, the animal can access. And because the animals are microchips, like your pet cat is, the computer can recognize the specific baboon who's accessing the screen. So this means that the computer can tailor an experiment, a touchscreen experiment, to that particular animal. And there's a food dispenser, a robotic food dispenser, connected to the apparatus so they can deliver a food reward. And what this means is that you can basically set up pretty much any experiment you can think of that can be done with a touchscreen and run an enormous amount of data with animals that are choosing when to take part in the experiment and whether to take part in the experiment. This has completely revolutionized what you can do with primate experiments. So when we ran this experiment with Nico, after a week, he sent me back a data file with about 30,000 trials on it, which is many orders of magnitude more than you could do with an experiment that involved a human experimenter. So we decided to piggyback on a design that these animals already knew how to do, which is this. So you basically have a grid of buttons, 4 of them light up, and then you try and touch the 4 that lit up straight away. Now it's not the Simon game, but it has some properties similar, right? You get stimulus, and then you have to remember it and recall it and play it back. Okay, so it's not exactly the same as the Simon game, but it has this similar quality of this kind of immediate imitation. Now the baboons can do this task. They sometimes make mistakes. So what we did was we had all of the baboons in the facility were playing this game. Most of the time, they're just getting random grids over and over again, just completely random grid patterns. But at any one time, one of the baboons is designated the kind of transmission baboon. And that baboon is getting 50 grid patterns that were produced by a previous baboon in the experiment. And when I say produced, it's the grid patterns that that baboon pressed on, whether or not they got it right or wrong. After you've got those 50 responses, that animal goes back into the pool of animals just doing random grid patterns. And you take those 50 responses and give them to another baboon as the transmission baboon. And that process repeats. Okay? So it's basically the same setup as the Simon game, but with baboons and these grid patterns. So we started this experiment off with 50 random grid patterns, and then we would just evolve it over generations to see how they changed. So just as in the Simon game, the task gets easier over generations. So what's nice about this is we can actually have matched trials. So the animal that's the transmission baboon, we look at their 50 random trials just before they were the transmission baboon, and that gives us a nice baseline. The random trials looks like they're getting worse, but they're not statistically, that's flat. But it's very clear that the transmission trials are getting better and better at it. So just as in the Simon game, something is happening to the grid patterns, not to the animals, to the grid patterns, such that this task is getting easier and easier. So I'm just going to show you one of these transmission chains of grid patterns. We did this multiple times. And I'll just show you what happens. So this is all 50 grids, the random grids initially. And I've colored some of them in. Don't worry about the colors just now. The baboons don't see colors, but showing you the colors make it more obvious what's going on. Okay. So this is just a random set of 50 grids. This is what the baboon produced, the first baboon produced. Okay. And then the second one, third. Okay, and that's the end. So it should be fairly clear what's going on here. People always say, oh, this was not what we were expecting, and they don't really mean it, but we really were not expecting our French baboons to invent Tetris. Um, that's for sure. Yeah, so these are the tetrominoes. Um, that's some maths notation for it, but this is what you all think they are. Yeah, so Tetris pieces, right? So these are all the pieces that you can make out of four contiguous squares put together. Just so you know, in the random, if they had no biases, if every possible grid combination uh, was equally prevalent in this data, this is what it would look like over generations. So the even in random grid patterns, you'll get some tetrominoes just by chance, but there's not very many. And this is what we actually saw in the experiment, right? So there's clearly tetrominoes are appearing here. Now, let's just think about why that might be happening. So there's all sorts of things we thought about. It's like, right, so it's easier, right? You don't have to move your hand as far to touch all the buttons. So maybe these are evolving to become easier to produce. So it's a pretty reasonable assumption. But when we actually measured what the animals were doing, they weren't producing them in an efficient way. So they would hop about sometimes to do them. So we're thinking, well, maybe visually somehow it's easier to copy these tetromino shapes because somehow you don't have to sort of keep track of the gaps or something. But for me, the most startling thing about this experiment is that that's all wrong. In fact, the tetrominoes are harder for the baboons to copy. In the random trials, which remember we've got for this experiment, the non-tetromino shapes are copied better than the tetromino shapes. So baboons do worse on tetrominoes. Now that seems like, what? How is that possible? Because it's that all these tetrominoes are appearing. But the point is that they do worse in tetrominoes in the random trials, but they do better in the transmission trials. Okay. So how do we make sense of that? What's going on here, and I think this literally can be the only explanation for what's going on, is that we've got a move from a regime where what's happening is there are lots of individual independent trials that are being copied to a regime where it's a whole system of shapes that are being copied. Once there's tetrominoes alongside other tetrominoes in that set of 50, they become easier to copy. Presumably because they form some kind of systematically observable and understandable generalization that can be made over the set of 50 trials. And actually, we've got some good evidence for this because if we look at different runs of the experiment, we get different proportions of the different tetrominoes. So there's some runs of the experiment are very squarey, and some runs of the experiment might have a lot of lines in them or whatever. And we can show that that lineage specificity is bigger than chance. And what that demonstrates is that the baboons must be creating some kind of systematic representation that's aiding the learnability of the set of grids. Okay, so that is a kind of cool result, but it is actually a little bit confusing as well. Because remember, I was saying this stuff about language being unique to humans, and uh, it's the result of this cultural transmission. But it looks like, we just took this cultural transmission and ran it on some baboons, and they do it too. So baboons are capable of doing this cumulative cultural evolution of systematic behavior, but they don't do it in the wild. And it seems like, with some really important and interesting exceptions, which I'll end my talk on, other species don't do it either. So what is going on? What is the difference between the baboons and the humans, right? Because that difference is the difference that will give us language. Well, here's the difference. So this is the apparatus that they have in Marseille. And the crucial thing is this food dispenser, right? So this food dispenser gives an incredibly reliable reward structure for copying, right? If the baboon copies, they get monkey chow. If they don't, they don't get it. So what the team in Marseille, Nico and Joël, have created is a really odd environment, and an environment where there is this super reliable reward for doing this behavior, right? Now, humans don't need this. In fact, we've run the same experiment with humans. Humans don't need a food dispenser. They just get it. They just want to copy, right? Humans love copying. Like anyone with kids knows this, right? That kids will copy what you're doing without knowing why. They'll say swear words without knowing what they mean. Humans are just wired for copying. So what I want to propose is that the crucial difference between us and our nearest relatives, other primates, is that we have something like this robotic food dispenser, but in our own heads. We have an endogenous reward system that rewards us for doing these tasks like copying that enable cultural evolution to happen in the first place. So this really takes us full circle. I mean, it's at the end was after this slide to think back to what the biological evolution of language should really be about. So we've talked a lot about cultural evolution, and what I'm suggesting to you is cultural evolution can build you the linguistic structure that we want to explain, but we need cultural evolution there to do it. So what's uniquely human, well, not completely uniquely as I'll say, but unusual to humans and unique amongst primates, is that we have evolved these reward mechanisms that enable this process of cultural transmission to take place at all. So the biological evolution story is a story about the mechanisms that enable culture. And then the cultural evolution story is a story about how those mechanisms build structured behavior like language. Okay, so just to conclude what we've gone over today, so I've said that our species' greatest trick is being able to talk about anything, and I think that's kind of obviously true. And the reason we can do that isn't complicated. It's that language is made up of these recombinable parts that has systematic statistical structure. That's why we're able to talk about anything. And it's cultural evolution that creates this systematic structure. And it does it because that structure enables language to be learnable. Okay, so cultural evolution, almost by necessity, finds learnable systems, and those learnable systems have these properties. And we can induce a similar kinds of results, at least of the same flavor, in another primate, as long as we have a way of experimentally scaffolding this cultural process. What we have to build for the primates, evolution has built for us. So I would argue that what makes us unique isn't some kind of organ that's wired for structure, not some kind of biological pre-specification of language in our cognition, but rather our very odd and unusual kind of obsession with cultural transmission. The fact that we do it all the time is what's evolved in our species and what we really need to understand. So all of this kind of makes one last prediction, which is going to sort of end with, it makes a prediction about where else we might find something similar to language, where else in nature. And I would argue the places we need to look are, we need to look at species that have behaviors, complex behaviors, signaling behaviors that are transmitted culturally. And luckily for us, those species do exist. They're importantly different in many crucial ways from humans, which would be another talk. But those species are the species of many birds and whales. And so a lot of like future work in this area is going to be looking at birds and whales to see the similarities and differences in the signaling that those species produce. Okay, so thank you very much. Thanks to all my collaborators. And there's like 3 QR codes. You can point your phones at if you want, for PDFs of the papers I've talked about. Thank you.
So it's 7:35. If you need to leave, go now, but I think we can go till 7:45 with questions, and then I think the food is out there, and so, go ahead. And Simon, if you want to govern your questions.
Well, I'm just wondering if, since we may have ones on
Charles,
would you be happy to field point to questioners or choose questions? Okay. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with the first one, and then it's time we'll do the second one. My question is about efficiency. Efficiency is defined as a maximum output for a minimum input. So it's do the same with the language. So efficient language is one which is able to convey the message with minimum number of words, has ability to convey nuances, has wide vocabulary for use, and so on. So if a tool, language, or a custom is used by a large number of people with high cooperative abilities, it is likely to become more efficient over time than if it is used by a smaller number of people with lower cooperative abilities. On that basis, I would argue that English is, in general, the most efficient language. Would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, certainly. So I think there is a lot of really interesting work can be done looking at efficiency, and a lot of what we do is looking at tensions that exist between learnability and efficiency. So the most learnable language by far is a language that has just one word, and it's used for everything. It's very, very easy to learn. So in fact, we have run experiments where all that needs to happen is that you learn the language. And what you get is essentially that. You get languages that only have one word for everything. Now, the problem with that language, as I'm sure you're all aware, is it's incredibly poor for communication, right? You can't just go around going ugh all the time. So there has to be this countervailing pressure, a pressure for communicative effectiveness, basically. And that you can have languages that are incredibly communicatively effective, but are not very learnable. And that's what you saw in my experiment, where we saw these like super fast gestures. Those are actually quite effective. They're very efficient. You all guessed what they meant, but they're not very learnable. So it turns out that what you get in language is an optimal trade-off between efficiency pressure and learnability pressure. So there's a lot of beautiful work by some people in this room that explore that trade-off, and I think that's a really great future direction for linguistics. What I would counter is saying that there's necessarily a relationship between that and population size. There are people who argue there is, and they have people who argue various different aspects of that, and that's something you can test experimentally.
Okay, we take a question from Andreas online. Question is, why aren't people better at copying linguistic strings, given that linguistic sequences have passed through countless generations of cultural evolution? How are things like the broken telephone game possible?
So how are they better, or why aren't they better?
Why do we see errors? If you
Oh, right, why do we see errors?
Yeah.
No, that's an excellent question. I mean, so I think it's probably a similar answer, I guess, because what we're finding isn't the optimal for, because languages don't just have to optimize that transmissibility pressure, they have to optimize a bunch of other pressures. So in the broken telephone game, I mean, part of that game works because you deliberately force the players to be less clear. You say whisper. So they're actually producing strings that are sounds that are suboptimal for transmission. So people can play with these different ramp up and ramp down these different pressures. But I think language finds a pretty impressively optimal place in these multiple competing pressures that are placed on it.
Thanks. There's a question over here. Yes.
Yeah. That's a super interesting question. I don't know. I think it's an interesting line of reasoning. One caution I would say is that the effect that we see on the system language is the result of language being passed on by multiple people in a population over thousands of years. Actually, I think it happens a lot quicker than thousands of years, but that's another story. So we won't necessarily expect the language only to have optimized so that only people who have a certain set of traits will be able to acquire it. It may actually get to a point where people who, if there was just a population of those people, wouldn't have created the language, will deal with it just fine. I don't know. I think it's something that we really want to do in language evolution research, is to move away from just thinking about things in terms of neurotypical populations. So we have a PhD student, Edinburgh, Lauren Fletcher, who's thinking about autism and language evolution, and looking at experiments where different populations will do different things to the language that's being transmitted. So that's something I think would be a really exciting area of further work.
I think we have time for one more question. We'll see what we very inspiring talks and lots of one way to look at the data is things get a little bit simplified to make for generations. I think we have some analogies in language history that we know this still doesn't explain how we quietly to the reward system as tricks to do that. But the reward system is one of those engine systems of the brain which had been there way before then. So coming back to the title, how do you think about it?
Yeah, excellent. So I agree that a lot of what I'm talking about involves simplicity. So that I think that there's probably a universal learning bias for simpler systems. There's a kind of quite good support for that, thinking about that. And that what's happening in this process of cultural evolution is movement to simplicity. But remember, again, as I've said, there's this countervailing pressure for expressivity, and a lot of what's going on is the tension between those two. In language change, we might expect to see some simplification, but you might also then see complexity arising in other places in the system. So I expect we're kind of moving along this kind of optimal frontier between these two in language change. We can look at language emergence, so cases where languages emerge. We're very lucky. There's about 75 languages right now that are in the process of emergence, and these are sign languages, often in rural communities, where some number of deaf individuals have been born in that community and spontaneously creating a language, and then that's transmitted over generations. So we can see that early stage there. But I think what you're getting at with your second part of your question is, yeah, but how did we evolve these things? Now, the reward system is indeed ancient, obviously. But one of the things that we want to think about is whether a rewiring, I said like a really kind of naive way of putting it, but a kind of rewiring of the reward system, a change in where reward is directed, could be going on. one really useful sets of species to look at are birds. And we can look at the reward system in birds for learning song. And then we can understand the neural circuits behind reward there and the genetics there to see whether in fact that is potentially a relatively small change that could happen in the primate lineage that could have caused this change in the kinds of things that we get buzz from. Because it's clearly true, right, that we get, you know, we get that dopamine hit for copying something well. Other primates do not have that. So something must have happened there. Now, what I don't have for you is a story about like why, you know, why would that happen? But I think what I'm suggesting, it's a research program that I would not be able to do myself, but what I'm suggesting is where that's the kind of approach we should be taking to language evolution, rather than the kind of older approach, which would say we need to see the genes for phonology or some part of syntax and understand how they evolved, because I think we get them from culture.
I think that's a fabulous place to end with a stirring call to action. The call to action will be there is food out there. So I want to thank you again, Simon, for a really interesting topic. There are one more question. Yeah, so come on, have some food, ask your questions to Simon, and he'll be out here all week. So
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, please do. Come to the office and
yeah,
harangue me.
thank you very much.